Hello friends, I'm Abby and today I'm going to be talking to you about my worst and most disappointing books of 2020. I actually have had a very good reading year in 2020. I have read 180 books so far and we still have a week left of December. So I'm definitely choosing from a lot of books. But I ended up loving most of the books I read, or everything fell kind of in the middle of the road if I didn't love it. However, that doesn't mean that I don't have a few choice words to say about a few choice books on my list today. Now, all of these books I'm going to categorize as most disappointing. I was disappointed by all of these books. I wouldn't necessarily say that they're the worst. I would say almost all of these I gave 3 stars. I only gave less than 3 stars to 3 of the books on this list, and a 2-star rating isn't horrible. I only gave one book 1 star, and then a couple books I DNF'd, and I'm not going to include those on here. But I would say most of these were just disappointing. They're not awful books. I would still recommend them to some people, so take that with a grain of salt. If this is your favorite book that I'm talking about, I'm not trying to trash your taste in books. They were just disappointing for me, and I personally didn't like them. The first book I'm going to talk about is Dead Until Dark by Charlaine Harris. So this book is kind of a classic mystery romance novel, and it is the novel that inspired True Blood on HBO. So I was very excited for this vampire romance because I really love vampires, I really love romances, but this just lacked something for me. And I think for the most part, I really enjoyed the commentary. I really enjoyed the story as a whole. There were just aspects of this that were really lacking. One of the areas that it was really lacking was in exploring Sookie Stackhouse, who is the main character, and exploring her mind powers. So she can read minds, and in this world, vampires are just kind of like commonplace. They're all around, they're back in society, people are chill about it, but some people are like against vampires, and that's part of the commentary. But Sookie Stackhouse can read minds, except for with vampires. And so she's very intrigued by pursuing this relationship with this vampire named Bill. And I liked the romance between them. I think that it made a lot of sense. I really liked most of this book, but I think we needed more of her mind powers, which is a series. I know that. I don't like the book enough to continue the series. I wish there was more mind power stuff in this. I also really didn't like the plot device used at the end of this book. It's something that happens every once in a while in books, where a character will disappear at a moment of high tension with no word of warning and will just not be there when the character needs them to be there. And then the character has to save themselves, and then they pop up and they're like, oh my gosh, what happened? And that's fine sometimes. I don't always hate that. But there was no reason that Bill had to be gone. The reason Bill was gone didn't make any sense and was really boring. And I get that Sookie saved herself, and I really liked that aspect of it, but there just wasn't a reason for Bill to be gone. And sometimes there is a reason. There wasn't a reason in this one. Those are my thoughts. This was disappointing to me. I really wish I liked it more than I did. I really liked about 3/4 of it, but for the most part, I didn't love it enough to continue the series. Those are my thoughts on this book. The next book that really disappointed me this year was In a Dark, Dark Wood by Ruth Ware. I read Turn of the Key by Ruth Ware this year. Loved it. I thought it was great. I thought it had all of the thrilling aspects that people always talk about in Ruth Ware's novels. This book just was lacking in terms of the things that I love about thrillers. This book is kind of a bachelorette party gone wrong story, but the entire premise of the story is based on people being stuck in high school drama even though they're 35. Hated that. I thought that the setting of this book really could have been something special because it is a bachelorette party taking place in the winter in an isolated forest, an isolated cabin in the forest, and I thought that that could have been really great as a thriller setting, but it wasn't explored enough. They really didn't spend enough time in the cabin and didn't make the cabin feel isolating enough. I think the aspect of being invited to a bachelorette party for somebody you don't really know anymore, like a really old friend, was interesting, but these friends ended on bad terms, and then she got invited to her bachelorette party and just was like, yeah, I'll go. No, that's so unrealistic. Nobody would be like, yeah, sure. I mean, we haven't spoken in 10 years and we really got off on a bad foot, like, the last time we talked. We were not friends, but she invited me to her bachelorette party, so, like, I'm gonna go. No. Overall, this really just lacked a lot of the thrilling elements I was looking for. It was kind of predictable. It was kind of boring. I didn't feel connected to the characters. In fact, I hated almost all of them. And the only ones I did like were such minor characters that I didn't feel like we had enough of them. This was disappointing. Don't recommend this one. The next one. I don't think many people are going to be surprised to see this on my list or many people's lists this year, and that is The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. Again, this is not an awful book. I actually really enjoyed most of this book. It just was very disappointing for what I expected from Suzanne Collins and expected as an extension of the Hunger Games series. The Hunger Games series is one of the ultimate series for me. I loved it. The trilogy was fantastic. I didn't like parts of it. There were things I had problems with, but as a whole, it was such a fundamental series in my life. So this, I didn't really care about President Snow's story in this. I wanted to know before I started this book. I really wanted to know President Snow's backstory. I thought that this was going to be the creation of a villain, and I would have lived for that story. Instead, this was 400 pages of making you feel bad for this kid whose life is just kind of crazy, but he's really smart and he's adding all these cool things to the Hunger Games, but you're starting to believe that he is a really good person. And then at the end, it's just like, oop, just kidding, he's evil. What is that? That's not what I signed up for in this. It was way too long. I didn't love the areas that talked about President Snow's backstory. I just didn't care a whole lot. I cared about him as a character, but knowing what he turned into, I knew better than to get attached to him as this person. And rightly so, because I knew that he wasn't going to stay that person. But I don't think it explored enough about why he became the person that we see. It really was more of a hero story featuring President Snow, where rather than at the end where I could be rooting for him and I could understand why in the Hunger Games he became the villain, instead in this I rooted for him to kind of topple the villainous people, and then he just like turned around and became one of them for no reason. I did really like the areas in this book that talked about the stuff that President Snow added to the Hunger Games, because they were much more animalistic and basic before he became part of the team that ran the Hunger Games. And that was very interesting to see how some of those traditions became traditions that we see in the Hunger Games of the original series. But as a whole, I don't think this book was necessary. I don't think it added anything to the series, and I don't think that it was done super well. So it was a big old disappointment for me this year. Next is another book that I feel really bad to put on this list because, again, I didn't really dislike it, but that is Wicked Saints by Emily A. Duncan. I didn't dislike this book. I gave it 3 stars. I actually really enjoyed it all the way up to the end, which, again, this is a series, the start of a series. So I know that if I kept reading, it might resolve some of the issues I had at the end of this book. I just didn't feel connected enough to the characters to continue in this book. So this book really drew me in with the premise. This idea of a prince who was kind of fighting against his dad and fighting against what he has been brought up to believe. A girl who has magical powers where she can speak to gods, or she hears God's voices in her head. And a monster who is essentially in hiding and is trying to become more of a normal person and become more than what society expects him to be. That premise of those 3 characters coming together in this wintry Russia setting was great. And I actually really enjoyed a lot of this book. The things that made it disappointing for me, the ending I've already talked about. I'm not going to spoil it, but the ending I really didn't like. The gods aspect, I just didn't think was thoroughly explored. I wish there was more exploration into why the gods are talking to her and what's going on. I wish they talked to her more. I wish we got these deep conversations and learned more about what all of the gods did. And overall, I thought that the battle scenes were great. I thought that a lot of this book was really interesting, but to be honest, I don't even really remember much about it. I read so many books this year, so many great books, that this book really was just a disappointment for me, and I don't think I'm going to continue in the series. I might someday come back to this when I'm in a different headspace and see it completely differently, but for me, this just wasn't it. The next 2 books I really debated about whether to include on this video, but I'm going to include them. The first one, All the Ugly and Wonderful Things by Bryn Greenwood. I feel really bad about putting this on here because I think the writing in this is great. I flew through this book. I felt deep emotions about this book, and maybe I felt exactly what the author intended for me to feel. But what I felt in this book predominantly was disgust. I wouldn't say I enjoyed my reading of this book. I think a lot of people will tell you that that is the purpose of this book, is to make you uncomfortable and to make you question your biases and the way you look at the world. I did that, but I didn't like it. This book is about a little girl named Wavy who comes from a very troubled childhood. Her parents are not good, and this man named Kellen is much older than her, like in his early 20s when she is a child. He kind of takes care of her and becomes this father figure for her. He helps raise her, he cares for her, he takes her to school, he makes sure she has everything she needs and feels protected and safe. That's great. But this is essentially the love story between those two people. Now, nothing intense or sexual happens until she's 13 and he's a full adult. And part of the argument is that Kellen is not mentally the age that he actually is. He also comes from a very troubled background and is very emotionally immature. However, this book is predominantly about their love story, and even the back says love knows no boundaries, a beautiful and provocative love story between two unlikely people and the hard-won relationship that elevates them above the Midwestern meth lab backdrop of their lives. I never once was rooting for their relationship. In fact, I'm pretty sure that Wavy has an aunt in this that is like actively against the relationship and actively tries to stop it. And there are other characters who like kind of get weird vibes from them and are also trying to stop it. And we're supposed to take Wavy and Kellen's side in this? Let me just say, there are a couple scenes that happen at school and involve the children interacting with their teacher, and the teacher is not really doing anything about these concerns that she has about Wavy. And as someone who works in a school setting, especially as a counselor whose job is to find these kids and help them, watching all of these missed opportunities to help this child was awful for me. And watching this relationship develop between an adult man and a young girl, no matter how troubled the background was or how troubled they currently are, was messed up. I didn't like it. I couldn't support the relationship at all, and so the conclusion of this book, the revelations made in this book were not life-changing for me because I can't get past the disgust I feel over this relationship. I know that other people are able to, and I hope that someday I can come back to this and see what other people are seeing in this book, but I think right now, especially in the career path that I have and seeing the family that steps in for this girl and is really trying to help her, I couldn't do it with this book. Again, I see why people love it. Hopefully someday I can come back and re-examine it and see things differently. But right now, this was probably one of my most disappointing books of the year. And the other book I'm having a really hard time putting on this list is The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. This book is not bad. In fact, I just read it in a reading vlog, and you saw me talk about how enjoyable it was to read. I enjoyed my process of reading it and figuring it out. I loved the conclusion of this book, but this book ultimately was disappointing for me. It had been so hyped and so widely talked about in the book community that I thought this was going to be mind-blowing and life-changing, and ultimately I just didn't connect to the characters. I didn't like any of them. I thought it was confusing, and I didn't find myself wanting to know that they're okay and wanting them to escape. I had a hard time grasping the concept of this book. So overall, it was disappointing. I ended up giving it 3 stars. I think that the concept and the idea is fantastic, but the book overall didn't hit its mark. I do think that I'm going to keep this book because I want to reread it and see if I can pick up on more stuff now that I'm reading it. And I've been reading more reviews about it and discussions about it where people talk about how the characters contributed to the end goal. So maybe that might make me like the characters more in a reread of this book, but ultimately It missed the mark. It didn't do it for me. It was disappointing. The rest of the books I don't own, so I'm just going to pop up the cover on the screen for you. And I didn't buy them because they disappointed me. The first one is The Last Time I Lied by Riley Sager. Again, this isn't a bad book. It just disappointed me because especially Gabby Reads and some of my favorite booktubers have hyped this book. And I loved Home Before Dark by Riley Sager, which I just read this year as well. But I didn't like The Last Time I Lied. I don't remember anything about it. I remember that it's about a summer camp and a woman who is asked to come back to be a camp counselor, but the camp kind of has this history from when that woman was previously a child at the camp there, where this girl went missing while at the camp, and she's invited back to be a camp counselor. Weird things started happening again, and that's pretty much all I remember about it. I don't remember who the villain was. I don't remember any of the big twists, and I think that for me, that's what makes it disappointing, is that I didn't really care about these characters. They all were very like rich people problems, and I don't love those problems so much. It was ultimately just boring and didn't really impact me a whole lot. I don't have much else to say except that it wasn't at the same caliber, I think, as Home Before Dark, because Home Before Dark was one of my favorites of the year, and The Last Time I Lied, I couldn't tell you a single thing about it. I don't even remember the main character's name. The next book that was disappointing to me is not necessarily the book's fault. It was my expectations that made this book already be set up for failure. And that was In 5 Years by Rebecca Surley. I thought this book was going to be a romance. If you go into this book thinking it's going to be a romance, you're going to be wrong. This book is set up like a romance. The synopsis sounds like a romance because it's essentially about this girl who is living her life. She's engaged to this man. She's having a good time at work. She goes to sleep, and during the night, she has a dream that it's 5 years in the future. She is with a completely different man in a completely different apartment. She has a completely different job, and it feels so real to her that when she wakes up, she's certain that it's a premonition. And then she meets this man that in 5 years, she's supposedly going to be like waking up next to. So I think that this book had a really great premise. I think that the way it wrapped up was really good. This book had a couple things that happened in it that are not things I love in books. I'm not going to tell you what they are because they are spoilers, but they were just certain plot points that I didn't love, and this book was ultimately very sad. It was not a lighthearted romance, so please do not go into it thinking that it's that. I think if you go into it with an open mind and not expecting a romance, you might find more to love in this book. It's pretty short, and I think a very thorough story for how short it is. I personally just did not connect to it, and it let me down big time. Take that as you will. The next book that was disappointing to me was City of Girls. Again, I think this book was fine. It was really well written. I think there are points in this book that I really, really love, but it let me down because it's really long and the premise is really cool, but ultimately it was really boring. This is a story about a historical fiction story about a young girl who is sent to New York to live with her aunt because she has made some mistakes, and so she's living in New York in the 1920s during the theater boom. So she's like living her best theater life, which for me, I was like, yes, this book is right up my alley. But ultimately, it was just kind of boring. It took a couple cool twists and turns, but in the grand scheme of things, I don't remember anything about it. I don't think about it too often. I don't care about it a whole lot, and it let me down in terms of providing an intriguing story that keeps me thinking or keeps me excited or makes me think. I just don't remember much of it at all. And so in those terms, it's disappointing because it should have been more exciting for what it was advertised to be. Next is If You Must Know. I got this as an Amazon First Reads choice, and I did not like it. I almost DNF'd it, but I didn't. I pushed through. I don't really know why I did. It's kind of like a literary thriller. I didn't like it. It focuses on the story between these two sisters, one of whom is very like free and open, the other one is very uptight, and I think they were both very extreme depictions of people. I found myself relating more to the type A, like very organized personality, but ultimately I didn't like the conflict in this. I didn't like the exaggerated caricatures of people. I didn't like the twist. I didn't like the process it took for us to find out what was going on. I thought the twist was predictable and not worth the time it took for me to push through this book and read it. Well, it wasn't memorable. I don't remember a single thing about this book. Next is the book All We Ever Wanted by Emily Giffin. And this one, again, I was very conflicted because it's one where I feel like I must be missing something. People talk highly about this book, and I don't know why. It is essentially this story about this girl who has a picture of herself taken at a party, a very compromising picture, and it's sent out to a whole bunch of people and kind of messes with her life. And it's kind of a dual story between that girl and then her dad and the mom of one of the boys at the school. I think overall this book was filled with so much privilege and misuse of privilege that I couldn't stand it. By the end, I just kept thinking, what is the message here? Because the message should have been that privilege won't get you everything you want, it won't get you out of everything. But in the end, that's not the message that was told. I just don't understand what the point of this book was other than to make me mad. I just was mad the whole time. I was mad on behalf of all women. There are much better books out here that handle this premise without having it wrap up the way that it did in such an infuriating way where there are no consequences. What? Let's move on. The next disappointing book was The Confederacy of Dunces. This is a classic. It's won a whole bunch of awards. I don't know why. I really had to push myself to get through this book. I was hoping to enjoy it. I read it for my real life book club, and I didn't. I didn't enjoy it. As usual, after we talked about it at book club, I found more to enjoy about it, but honestly, I skimmed a lot of this book. It has a lot of very convoluted language, a lot of over-exaggeration of characters, a lot of conflict that didn't make a lot of sense and wasn't resolved. It just really ultimately didn't make a lot of sense, and I felt was trying way too hard to make a point that I didn't end up getting. The only reason this book didn't get DNF'd is because I was reading it for a book club, or I would have stopped reading it. So I guess if you're really into classics and you're interested in stories about men who have kind of been given everything all their lives and are now struggling to make it on their own, but not necessarily on their own. Like, it's kind of a comedy of errors where a whole bunch of stuff keeps going wrong for him, but like people keep giving him support and he pretends like he's not using it. I don't know. I didn't like the main character. I hated him. I didn't think he was funny, which a lot of people will say.
If you don't think Confederacy of Dunces is funny, you're not intelligent enough to get the humor.
I got what was supposed to be funny. I didn't think it was funny. Maybe it's just not for me, because I know that it's a classic and a lot of people love it, but I didn't. And I honestly will never read it again or recommend that anybody read it. That is going to be all for me today, friends. Thank you so much for watching. I had such a great time venting about these books a little bit. Again, almost all of them are really great books, very well written. They just weren't for me. And I'm sorry if I hurt anybody's feelings. That is not the intention. Please know that I fully support you. If you love these books, I can see why somebody would love any of the books I talked about in this. I personally did not love them. So if you find that you have similar reading tastes to me, feel free to use this video as you will. But if you don't, if you loved any of the books I talked about today, you do you. Keep reading them. I didn't love these books. I didn't hate most of them either, so keep that in mind. Comment down below what your least favorite book was this year. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, share this video with anyone who you think would enjoy it, and I will see you next time. Bye, friends!